The rod was warm when Mara picked it up. That was the first wrong thing. The lab had been sealed for 11 hours, the climate control running at a steady 4 degrees Celsius, and a piece of alien alloy sitting on a ceramic tray in the middle of all that cold air should have felt like holding a shard of February. Instead, it sat against her palm like something that had recently been breathing. She almost put it down. Almost. The vision hit her before she could decide. Not a dream, not the gentle fade of imagination. A hard cut, a seizure of light behind her eyes. She saw the Atlantic shelf from 40,000 feet, saw the water pulling back from the continental margins in a slow, monstrous exhalation, and she understood in some wordless place below language that what she was seeing had already happened, was happening, would be finished by morning. She set the rod down carefully on the tray and went to the window and looked out at the parking lot of the Reykjavik Institute for Geophysical Research, where the puddles in the asphalt were reflecting a perfectly ordinary October sky. Her hands were shaking. Her name was Mara Voss, and for 11 years she had published papers arguing that the signal anomalies in the deep ocean acoustic array were geological in origin. Tectonic hum. Thermal convection. She had written a very well-regarded monograph on the subject. She had a reputation, 2 grants, and a visiting fellowship that paid for the apartment with the view of the harbor. She went back to the rod. It was 7 inches long, hexagonal in cross-section, and composed of an alloy that the spectroscopy team had spent 3 months failing to characterize. It had been recovered from the Faroe-Shetland Channel 18 days ago, dredged up from below 4,000 meters of water by an automated survey rig that had been looking for methane clathrates. The survey company had sent it to the Institute as a curiosity. The Institute's director, a cautious Norwegian named Erik Solvang, had flagged it for Xenolinguistics review as a joke, a dig at Mara's department, which had spent a decade chasing signals in the noise. The joke had a weight of 340 grams and a thermal output of approximately 0.3 watts, and it had just shown her the death of an ocean. She picked it up again. This time she was ready, or thought she was. The vision didn't come for her gently. It came the way bad news comes, the kind that doesn't knock. She saw the gravity-siphon array in its entirety, a lattice of objects placed at precise intervals along the mid-Atlantic ridge, sitting quiet on the seafloor for decades, maybe centuries, woven into the planet's own electromagnetic skeleton so that every passive scan ever run across the deep ocean had mistaken them for geological features. She saw what they were built to do. She saw the math of it, not as numbers, but as a kind of physical understanding. The way you understand falling before you've done the calculations. And the math said that within 72 hours, approximately 2/3 of Earth's surface water would be drawn down through the siphon array and translated elsewhere. Not destroyed, translated. The vial, she didn't know that word yet, but it was there in the vision, written in a medium that bypassed language. The vial were not destroying the Earth. They were harvesting it. They were counting resources the way you take inventory before a purchase. The water was just the liquid asset column. Humanity was another line item entirely. A footnote maybe, a pest assessment. Mara put the rod in her jacket pocket and walked out of the lab without signing the checkout log. She drove south for 6 hours before the tremors started. She had been trying to reach the Institute director, who was not answering his phone. She had been trying to reach her department head, who answered, heard approximately 45 seconds of what she was saying, and told her she needed sleep. She had been trying to reach a journalist named Dan Faber, who had published a series of pieces on unexplained oceanographic events that had been politely ignored by the scientific community. But Dan Faber's last article had run 8 months ago, and his phone rang out to a voicemail box that was full. She tried him twice more. The second time, a man answered who was not Dan Faber. "Who is this?" Mara said. A pause. "We were hoping you could tell us where you are, Dr. Voss." She ended the call. Somewhere behind her on the ring road, a pair of headlights that had been maintaining exactly the same distance for the past 40 minutes maintained exactly the same distance. The tremors began as a low lateral oscillation, the kind that makes car windows rattle in their seals, and then the road ahead of her rippled. Actually rippled, like a wave passing through solid ground. And a section of tarmac 40 meters long dropped 2 feet and tilted, and she braked and the car fishtailed and came to rest on the shoulder with the front tires hanging off into what had been a drainage ditch and was now a fissure you could lose a child in. She got out with the rod in her pocket and the car keys still in her hand, habit being the last thing the brain surrenders, and she ran. The headlights behind her had stopped. She could hear doors. She ran toward the only light she could see, a farmhouse, maybe a kilometer off the road, sitting on a slight rise with its windows yellow against the dark. Behind her the ground cracked again, a long exhalation of fractured basalt, and she ran harder and didn't look back. The farmhouse belonged to a man named Sigurd Holt, who was 81 years old, who had spent 30 years working in seismic monitoring for the Icelandic Met Office before his retirement, and who answered the door with a shotgun in one hand and a mug of coffee in the other. "I know what that is," he said, looking at the shape in her jacket pocket before she'd said a word. "I need to use your phone," Mara said. "Phone's been down for 2 hours. He lowered the shotgun. "Come in. The coffee's fresh. His name," he told her over the kitchen table, "was not really Sigurd. That was for the neighbors. He had spent 12 years in his 50s, working for an organization that was no longer funded and no longer officially named, that had been convened in 1987 when a similar rod had been recovered from deep water sediment off the Azores. That rod had been studied and lost, misplaced in a decommissioning of a research station, or so the official record said. He believed it had been taken deliberately by people who understood what it meant and had decided that what it meant was an opportunity rather than a threat. "There are people," he said carefully, "who have known about the veil for a long time. Not everything, but enough to know that the siphon array exists, that it has a trigger point, and that the trigger had been set for the 2020s, plus or minus a few years, depending on certain geomagnetic conditions." He wrapped both hands around his mug. His knuckles were large and deliberate. They chose to let it proceed. Why? Because they were offered something in return. He looked at her steadily. Not for humanity. For them. Mara sat with that for a moment. Outside, the ground trembled. "The rod," she said. "What does it actually do?" He got up and went to a shelf above the fireplace and came back with the notebook. The old kind, cloth-covered, the pages swollen with age and annotated in 3 different colors of ink. He opened it to a diagram that she recognized immediately. Not because she'd seen it before, but because it matched what the vision had shown her. A network of nodes, scattered across the globe, strung together with lines that the diagram labeled with a word she didn't speak, but understood as something like counter-frequency. "The siphon runs on a resonance principle," he said. To start it, they had to tune it to Earth's own electromagnetic signature. That same tuning is its weakness. There are 7 relay points they use to anchor the array. If you can access those relay points and invert the signal, use their own resonance against the array, the siphon collapses. How do you invert the signal? He tapped the diagram. You need the rod. The rod is the key. It reads the local frequency and generates the inverse automatically. You just have to be at the right place. 7 relay points. 7. Where? He turned the notebook to face her, and she looked at the coordinates and felt something shift in her chest. 2 of them were in Iceland. 1 was in the Faroe Islands, 1 was in Scotland, 1 was in the Azores, 1 was in Newfoundland. 1 was in the seabed of the mid-Atlantic itself, inaccessible, but he had a note beside it in red ink that said, "If 6 of 7, it will be enough." "You've had this for 30 years, she said. "Yes, and you didn't. I was one man." He said it without self-pity, which was somehow worse. "I didn't have the rod, and I didn't know if I was right. I knew the theory. I didn't know the rod would work." He paused. "Does it work?" She thought of the warmth in her palm, the visions she hadn't asked for, the weight of 340 grams that had somehow carried the entire mechanism of the world's potential ending. "I think so," she said. He nodded, as if this was sufficient. Then you need to go. The 2 Icelandic sites first. They're closest, and if the tremors get worse, the roads will close. Come with me." He shook his head. He did it gently, the way you decline something you've been refusing for a long time. "There are people watching this house. Have been for years. If I leave, they'll follow me, and they'll find you. If I stay, they'll waste time watching me." He stood up and went to a kitchen drawer and came back with a folded piece of paper. "Coordinates. The 2 sites are marked. The farm road to the east will get you out before they reposition." She took the paper. She stood and then didn't immediately leave because there was something she needed to say and she wasn't sure how to say it. "For 30 years," she started. "Go," he said, not harshly. "There's no version of this where the time I lost matters. The only time that matters is what's left." She went. The first site was a cairn on a basalt plain 3 kilometers east of the farm, which was also the remains of a relay emitter that had been dormant for so long that 100 years of moss had grown over it and a family of Arctic foxes had denned in its base. Mara crouched beside it in the dark and took out the rod and put her bare palm against the stone. The rod found it. She felt the moment of contact between the rod's output and the emitter's dormant frequency as a sound she wasn't hearing. The auditory equivalent of a color she had no name for. And then the rod grew hot in her hand. And the cairn shivered, and the moss on its upper surface burned away in a clean circle. And the stone beneath glowed for 3 seconds with a light that wasn't quite any wavelength she recognized. Done. The rod cooled. She checked her watch. 51 hours remaining according to the vision, though she didn't entirely trust that translation. She got back in the car and drove to the second site. The second site was harder. It was on the edge of a fissure that the recent tremors had opened in the lava field north of Grindavik, and by the time she got there the fissure had widened to 3 meters, and the site itself, another ancient structure that had been catalogued as a Bronze Age monument by archaeologists who had assumed it was human-made, was on a shelf of rock on the wrong side of the gap. She looked at it for a long moment. She had been good at long jump, briefly at 15. She had been good at a lot of things briefly, and most of them had slid away under the weight of academic seriousness. She checked the gap. She checked the shelf. She checked the rod. "All right," she said to no one. She backed up, ran and jumped. She made it. The landing was bad. Both knees, one wrist, her chin catching the edge of the shelf. And she lay on the rock for a moment with her face against the stone, and the rod in her fist was already hot again because it had found the emitter through the rock without her even asking. She pressed it flat against the surface and felt the second activation shiver through the lava field, and somewhere below her the fissure stopped widening. Not closed, stopped, as if something that had been pulling it apart had briefly relaxed its grip. 2 down, 4 to go before she got to the sea. She looked back at the gap. The shelf she was on had dropped about 6 inches in the jump. "Huh," she said. She took out her phone, which miraculously still had signal, and called the only number she hadn't tried yet. The emergency contact listed in Dunfaber's old articles, a logistics email routed through a server in the Faroe Islands that he'd told readers to use if they ever had information they couldn't share through official channels. She sent one message: "I have the rod and a notebook and 6 coordinates, and I need someone who can sail." She got back across the gap by finding a narrower point 40 meters north, took a running start, and made it with less drama than the first time. Her phone buzzed when she reached the car. The message said, "Haraldur, Pier 9 Thoshaven, don't be late." Haraldur was 63, spoke 4 languages, and had captained research vessels in the North Atlantic for 30 years, before retiring to run a small mail and cargo service between the Faroes and Iceland. He had also, he explained, been Dan Faber's source for 2 of the pieces Faber had published on unexplained deep-water acoustic events. Faber had been arrested 14 months ago on charges that Haraldur described with a flat, precise anger as creative. He was not in contact with Faber. He didn't know if Faber was still alive. He listened to everything Mara told him without interrupting. He looked at the notebook for a long time. He picked up the rod, held it for 3 seconds, put it down, and rubbed his palm on his thigh. "You saw something," Mara said. "I saw the water," he said. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. They left Thorsham before dawn with a crew of 2. Haraldur and a young woman named Asa, who was his niece and his deckhand, and who had apparently been told nothing except that they were making an unscheduled run, and who had responded to this information by packing extra fuel and not asking questions. Mara decided she liked Asa enormously. The Faroe site was on Strimoy, on a headland that Haraldur knew because he'd fished below it for 20 years. He recognized the marker stones from the notebook diagram without her having to explain. He stood back and let her work and watched the rod do what it did. That clean, not quite light, radiating through the rock, and he breathed slowly through his nose the whole time the way a person does when they are keeping themselves very calm. "It's real," he said afterward. Not to her, to himself. "Yes," she said. "Then we go to Scotland." They went to Scotland. The people following her had lost her track somewhere between Grindavik and the harbour, which bought them time, but on the second day at sea, somewhere in the waters between the Faroe Islands and the Hebrides, a rigid inflatable appeared on their starboard quarter and ran alongside them at matching speed. 4 people, civilian clothes, but the way they moved on the deck was not civilian. Haraldur didn't change course or speed. He said, "There's a flare locker under the port console. The bottom shelf." Mara found what he meant, not flares. 3 of them with a note in his handwriting that said, "Hopefully never." She had never fired one. She had some understanding of the principle. The inflatable came alongside. A man stood up in the bow with a loudspeaker and told them to heave to and prepare to be boarded. "Asa," Haraldur said. "Engine room." Asa went without a word. The inflatable bumped their hull. Mara came out of the pilot house with one of the things from the flare locker, and the man with the loudspeaker looked at her, and the loudspeaker came down, and she could see the calculation happening in his face. What she was holding versus what he'd expected to find, which was apparently one woman with a metal stick. "I have 4 sights left," she said. "Yours is not one of them." A pause, wind, the slap of the North Atlantic against both hulls. "What were you offered?" she said. "I want to know. Not asking because it matters. Just want to know the price." The man looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his face that she thought might have been shame, though it was hard to be certain at that range. "We were told our families would be resettled," he said. "Off-world." She thought about Sigurd Holt, not Sigurd, the man with the notebook who wouldn't tell her his real name, sitting in his farmhouse for 30 years, counting down to this. She thought about Dan Faber in whatever room they'd put him in. She thought about 2/3 of the world's surface water being drawn down through a hole in the world's electromagnetic skeleton, so that some calculation somewhere registered Earth as having been assessed and catalogued. "Off-world," she said, "and you believe that?" The man said nothing. "Step back," she said. He stepped back. She didn't entirely know why he did, but she thought it might have had something to do with the fact that she was holding what she was holding with complete steadiness in a North Atlantic chop. And she had not aimed it at anyone, and the combination of those 2 things sometimes communicated more than threats do. The inflatable pulled back. It didn't pursue them. Asa came back from the engine room and looked at the retreating inflatable and then at Mara. "Flare," she said. "I made a face," Mara said. Asa laughed, short, surprised, real, and went back to her station, Scotland, the Azores, Newfoundland. The tremors were worsening globally by the time she reached the Azores. She knew because Haraldur had a shortwave radio and they listened to it in fragments between ports. The Atlantic had not yet begun to drain. What was happening was the precursor, the siphon array warming up, stressing the seafloor like a hand flexing before a grip. But the coastal cities were recording anomalous tide behavior, and the deep-water monitoring buoys were returning readings that the oceanographic agencies were describing as equipment malfunction, because the alternative was not something they had a protocol for. She activated the Azores relay in a thunderstorm on a hilltop above Fayal crouching over a stone that predated any human habitation of the island. The rod burned violet that time. All the previous activations had been in the cooler end of the spectrum, blue-white, and the shift unsettled her. She told Harolder. "Means you're getting close to the needed threshold," he said. He'd read the notebook 3 times by then. He knew it better than she did in some ways. The system is reacting. It knows something is inverting. Can it stop me? He thought about that. The notebook says the array is automated, no one sitting at a console. It wasn't designed for someone to fight back, because they never expected us to. Because they never expected us to, he agreed. Newfoundland was the last land site. The crossing took 31 hours, the worst seas of the trip, and Mara spent most of it below deck with the rod in her hand, not holding it for the visions. She'd stopped trying to control that, but because the warmth of it had become, in some embarrassing way she would never say aloud, a comfort. It was the enemy's instrument, and she was using it against them, and there was something in that not funny, then at least structurally satisfying. The Newfoundland site was near a town called Twillingate, on a headland above the sea, marked by a rock formation that 3 generations of locals had assumed was a natural phenomenon. She activated it at 3 in the morning, with the Atlantic spread below her, and the rod so hot in her hand it should have burned. The ocean below the headland shuddered. Not a tremor, not the siphon flexing. The sound, that not quite sound she associated with activation, rang out across the water and she felt it go, the 6th inversion signal joining the chain. 6 of 7. The notebook said it would be enough. She stood there for a moment with the cooling rod in her hand and listened. The ocean was still there. The collapse of the siphon array took 11 minutes, which she knew because she timed it. It didn't announce itself dramatically. The tremors stopped. That was the first thing, like a headache lifting, the absence of something you'd stopped noticing because it had gone on too long. Then the deep water monitoring buoys, which had been returning catastrophic readings for 2 days, abruptly began returning readings that were merely anomalous, and then merely unusual, and then, by midnight on the 3rd day, normal. The water stayed. Mara flew back to Reykjavik and filed 11 separate requests for emergency review of the Faroe Shetland Channel artifact with every scientific body she thought might eventually listen. She expected most of them to take years. She expected most of them to be quietly buried. She expected to spend a significant portion of the next decade in rooms arguing with people who were already certain. She was not, broadly speaking, wrong about any of that. But she had the notebook, and she had the rod, and she had Harolder's logs of the crossings, and she had Asa's timestamps, and she had the shortwave recordings, and she had the spectroscopy data from the lab in Reykjavik that no one had thought to classify because no one had believed it was relevant. She sat down at her desk in the institute and opened the first review request and started filling in the fields. The rod was on the desk beside her, still warm. That detail didn't appear in any report she wrote. It was the kind of thing that wouldn't survive a peer review. She noted it privately, in her own handwriting, in the back of a new notebook she had bought for the purpose. "Warm," she wrote. "Why is it still warm?" She didn't know, but she set the notebook down and got back to work, because the visions had shown her one thing she hadn't yet told anyone. The array was gone, and the 6 relay points she'd activated were dark now. Burnt-out nodes. The Veil would know what had happened. They would look at their data, and they would see a planet that had assessed the threat, located the mechanism, and dismantled it from the inside with a team of 2.5 people and a borrowed boat. She didn't know what they'd make of that. She suspected they hadn't filed a category for it. She suspected they'd have to open a new one. The first review request had a word count limit. She typed carefully, precisely, without drama. Outside, the harbor was full of water, the same as it always had been, the same as it was going to be for a good while longer. The sky was ordinary. The puddles in the parking lot reflected the gray October morning. She submitted the request and opened the next one. She hummed while she worked, an old song, something her mother had sung. She couldn't remember all the words, It didn't matter. She had time.